Hey guys, it is Bible Scribe. Welcome back. I finally feel like I'm back in a rhythm again with some of these videos after my huge series I just released on Satan. If you missed that, go back. It is incredible. This video is about the question many people have: why were there some unclean animals in the Old Testament? And we're going to use the scriptures for that, but we're also going to look at some other things so we get a clear picture of why God may have chosen certain animals to be unclean and other animals to be clean for the Israelites when he gave them the Levitical law. So let's look at, I have a slideshow to go with this. Let's look at kind of our overview. Why were some animals unclean? We're going to review a new perspective about clean and unclean status of animals according to this Levitical law. And so our kind of outline is going to be an introduction. We're going to go into Leviticus chapter 11. That is the chapter of the Bible that mentions all the unclean animals and why and etc. And then we're going to look at an early Christian writing of the first century called the Epistle of Barnabus. And then we are going to look at a couple points that probably will come to mind out of what we are reading in these different sources. And then we're going to summarize that at the end. So Leviticus 11, I opted to read through this, but decided against it. It's kind of lengthy as far as just reading out. So we're not going to read through all of Leviticus 11. I encourage you to do that on your own, just to see how it words things and exactly what it says. But I'm going to kind of summarize what it gives us in the next couple slides. So it does go through clean and unclean animals. And so in Leviticus 11, it says, on the clean side, in the first little part, it says cloven-footed animals that chew the cud are clean. And this would include cows, sheep, goats, that kind of farm animal, if you will, that's pasturable, that they would keep in their pastures. I mentioned fish with fins and scales. I think that's actually supposed to be on the next slide. But then on the unclean side, it's animals without a divided hoof. You know how a cow hoof has like two parts to it when you look at it, two big nails or whatever you might call them. Well, an unclean animal would not have that. It would be all one hoof or no hoof at all, like just a foot. Unclean also would not chew the cud, and this means is just a phrase meaning the way that goats or cows chew the grass. They chew it and munch it and really digest it heavily. And consistently, that's most of their lives is just eating. So that's what that means. And then it mentions a few animals in contrast to a cloven-footed or divided hoof and chewing the cud animal. It mentions a coney, which is like either a rabbit or a badger, a hare, a camel, a swine, which is obviously a pig, and fish or water creatures without fins or scales. And so, like I said, I meant to have the fish thing on this next slide. It's in a second paragraph in Leviticus 11, but it's, on the clean side, it's any fish that has fins and scales, like, cod or whitefish or, any normal kind of fish you would see with the shiny scales and fins on it. This, on the unclean side, this would be fish or water creatures without fins or scales. So you're talking about all the soft-skinned fish like catfish, all the bottom dwellers, all of the sharks and cartilage-based fish. That's all unclean. Only clean fish are the ones with scales and fins. So that was their guidelines for ocean, water mammal or water creatures. And then it goes into a section that talks about birds and fowl. And so on the unclean side, it listed a ton of them. And I'll just read through this list real quick. Again, this is why we don't read the whole chapter, because it just goes on about the animals that are included or not. But on the unclean side for fowl or birds, we have eagles, ossifrage, which is like a bone-breaking vulture type bird. They have them in Palestine, in that area. They actually bring carcasses up and drop them on rocks to break open the bones, and then they eat the bone marrow. But anyway, ospreys, which is kind of like an eagle of the sea or whatever, a vulture or buzzard, kites, ravens, owls, nighthawks, cuckoos, hawks, cormorants, swans, pelicans, storks, herons, lapwings, and bats, all unclean. And so, almost all those birds, if you know much about birds, you'll realize those are all, they all feed on the dead, essentially. They feed on or take prey. They don't work for their own food. They take and hunt prey or eat of the dead, which is also very unclean as far as the law is concerned. So that is the type of bird that is not included and is not clean for the Israelites to eat. And then there's a section in Leviticus, another paragraph or so, that talks about bugs, really, bugs and insects. And so on the unclean side, it starts with that actually, and it says, any flying things that also creep on their feet. And that includes insects and bugs. It's not talking about birds anymore. But all other flying things that creep, other than the ones on the clean side, and that's locusts. It mentions a thing called a bald locust, which I'm not sure exactly the difference. It mentions a beetle and a grasshopper, that those would be clean to eat. If you remember in the New Testament, when John the Baptist was in the wilderness, before he came and started preaching Christ's coming, that he was eating locusts and honey. And so that was a clean food for the Israelites according to Levitical law. Now, the other source we're going to go to understand, because in the Bible, all it says is that, all these animals are clean, but here's how you identify unclean, but here's how you identify the clean animals. It's the divided hoof, it's the, it's this or that's the fish with scales or not. And so it gives all those guidelines, but that passage in Leviticus 11 doesn't say much more. It just says this is what you are to do as a part of the Levitical law. But we have this early Christian writing called the Epistle of Barnabus that was written in the first century, like the time of the apostles and the time of the Corinthians and the Ephesians and Galatians and Christ. And so this gives us a clearer picture of the thought at the time of why those things were written that way. And I would say, based on my reading of the whole book, we're not going to read the whole book or the Epistle of Barnabas, but based on my reading and my thoughts on it, it seems that it is written by a Jewish Christian in the first century. He seems to have complete knowledge of all Jewish custom and all Jewish law, but then he also, obviously, throughout this epistle, it's a Christian writing. He's talking about Christ and the difference. And so one of the things he goes through is this clean and unclean animals information, and he tells the story behind it, pulls it apart, if you will. It is dated by scholars as a first century writing, and even some of the early church fathers, and I'm not going to name any because I think I'll get it wrong, but I'm talking about in the vein of like Irenaeus and Tertullian, those kinds of guys, early church fathers. They said this work was attributed to Barnabas. So that's why, of course, it's called the Epistle of Barnabas. And I included this for, some of my viewers who continuously think that I'm pulling Gnostic texts to use as source material, and that is not true. This is not a Gnostic text. It is a Christian text, you idiot. So, in the Epistle of Barnabas, everything we're going to look at is in chapter 10. And so it specifically talks about the unclean and clean animals. And here's what it says in the first two verses. It kind of sets it up for us. For as much as Moses said, ye shall not eat seine or eagle or falcon or crow or any fish which hath no scale upon it. And you remember those are the things we read right out of Leviticus 11. He received in his understanding 3 ordinances. Yea, and further, that means in addition to the commands not to eat those things, he saith, meaning God saith unto them in Deuteronomy also, I will lay as a covenant upon these people my ordinances. So this writer, Barnabas, then says, so then it is not a commandment of God that they should not bite with their teeth, but Moses spake it in spirit. The writer is saying that in addition to just the plain old commandment, He's saying these were also ordinances, and they were about spiritual things. And so there was like a dual meaning to why they were given. Not just because, oh, this animal is clean and this one's unclean, or this one's healthy and this one's not healthy, but that there was a spiritual meaning behind every single animal that was chosen as a part of the clean versus the unclean list. And so that's the information that this Epistle of Barnabas is going to give us in the next few verses. And what it actually does, it breaks it down. Each verse talks about a specific different animal and why it was mentioned as unclean in the Levitical law. It's very amazing. I encourage you, if you have time, go and read the Epistle of Barnabas. It is an incredibly good writing, has a lot of great information beyond just what we're going to go through in this video. But in verse 3, it says this, accordingly, he, meaning Moses, mentioned the swine with this intent. Thou shalt not cleave, saith he, to such men who are like unto swine. That is, when they are in luxury, they forget the Lord, but when they are in want, they recognize the Lord. Just as the swine, when it eateth, knoweth not his Lord, but when it is hungry, it crieth out, and when it has received food again, it is silent. So I read through that, and I'm going to read through these passages quick, but we're going to then hit the points that came out of them. So that point, the points of verse 3 is that, we're talking about swine or pigs, and this is a representation for the Israelites of men who forget the Lord when they are satisfied. So when they have their stomachs full and they have a nice place to live and they're taken care of and they're happy, they start to forget the Lord. But then when they're in want and they start, they don't have food, they're, being oppressed by, enemies, whatever it is, they start crying out to the Lord. And so that is the picture of the swine and why it was unclean or deemed unclean by God for the Israelites, to represent this sin that God did not want them to commit. And so my question just after reading that was, did the Jews do this? When God was taking care of them and everything was fine, this just made me think of this. Were they still crying out and worshiping God, or did they turn away and they got fat and sassy and they started doing their own thing and they forgot about God and they go after idols, they go after prostitution, they go after all these different things. So it's just something to think about. Even though this was the picture God gave them of this sin, they still committed it. Very, very interesting. In verse 4, it says this, neither shalt thou eat the eagle, nor falcon, nor kite, nor crow. Thou shalt not, he saith, cleave unto or be like unto such men who know not how to provide food for themselves by toil and sweat, but in their lawlessness they seize what is belonging to others, as if they were walking in guilelessness, watch and search about for someone to rob in their rapacity. Just as these birds alone do not provide food for themselves, but sit idle and seek how they may eat the meat that belongs to others, persistent in their evil doings. The description of how these birds of prey steal their food instead of working for it. It talks about the falcon, the kite, the crow. And this represents specifically the sin of men who do not work to provide for themselves, but instead they seize others' possessions that they have not worked for. They haven't worked for, these other people have worked for, but they seize those possessions by lawless means. And this just immediately made me think of, what are we seeing in politics today? We see a lot of politicians that are making a lot of money off of their governing instead of, doing it as they should for the people, et cetera, et cetera. But that politicians and our governments seem to be, by lawless means, taking the possessions of others. And we could go down a long road with that, but I won't go there. But just to mention it, this is the sin that specifically these birds of prey were representing in the Levitical law, and that God wanted the Israelites to steer away from. In verse 5, he talks about the lamprey, the polypus, or cuttlefish. It says, thou shalt not, he meaneth, become like such men who are desperately wicked and already condemned to death, just as these fishes alone are accursed, and they swim in the depths, not swimming on the surface like the rest, but dwell on the ground beneath the deep sea. So the lamprey, the polypus, and the cuttlefish. And this, these fish, they are bloodsuckers, and they feed on refuse on the bottom of the ocean. And they, this is a representation of men who are unrepentant and wicked in their ways, just completely gone. And these men are the type that realize how gone they are, how lost, and they're indignant about it. They don't even care. And so they hide in the shadows, and they prey on the weak and the refuse of others. And so again, a representation by these three fish who live in the depths of the abyss, or the ocean, as they would say, as the definition of an unrepentant and wicked heart of a man. In verse 6, chapter 10, Epistle of Barnabas, moreover, thou shalt not eat the hare. Why so? Thou shalt not be found a corrupter of boys, nor shalt thou become like such persons, for the hare gaineth one passage in the body every year, for according to the number of years it lives, it has just so many orifices. Now, I know that is a little hard to understand. I think it has to do with translation. I think it has to do with some of the words we're not used to seeing. But here's what that's saying, and this is a tough one. It's talking about hares, or rabbits, men who are corrupters of boys. Now, I'm not going to really, I don't think I need to dive into the details of what that means. I think you get it. But then it has this mention in this passage of the rabbit has a passage through the body for every year it's alive, and it mentions the multiple orifices. Now, I found a clue to what this might exactly be saying from Pliny the Elder in the 1st century. He has a book called Natural History, and in book 8 of that, verse 81, it says that hares have a fold inside their bowels for each year of life that they have lived. And we can only assume that he did this natural history book as a project. He was trying to tell the truth. He wasn't making things up. But all these kind of hints together, I think they go to a place where you can understand what a corrupter of boys means. And the only other thing I'm going to say about that is, have you read the Talmud? Because it mentions things about sexual promiscuity with boys. And I'm going to just pose the question to you, does it allow for them? That's something you should look up and find out. It might be surprising. It might scare you to death. But if you can do some searching online, it's not hard to find information about that. So this hare being an example of men who corrupt young boys, and that is a sin that God was warning the Israelites about. Again, neither shalt thou, and this is verse 7 of chapter 10 of the Epistle of Barnabas, neither shalt thou eat the hyena. Thou shalt not, saith he, become an adulterer or fornicator, neither shalt thou resemble such persons. Why so? Because this animal changeth its nature year by year, and becometh at one time male, and at another time female. So the points in this verse, we're talking about the hyena, and the point is that this is a representation of adulterers and fornicators. And so we know exactly what adultery means, but fornication is kind of somewhat ambiguous. It means a broad array of different things, sexual in nature. And so the statement about the hyena, that it changes its nature, is interesting. It changes its nature being at one time male and another time female. So if you do some reading on this, and I have done this, even modern science books talk about the fact that they seem to have attributes, sexual organ attributes of male and female parts in their anatomy. And so at the time this was written, they didn't do a lot of scientific research on animals necessarily. So the understanding of the hyena in the 1st century was that it truly at times could be male and then change at other times to be female. And I'll let you do the research on why that is, why, physically that is the case with the hyena, but it is the true perception of the hyena, especially in the first century, that they had both sets of parts. And so I'm just gonna leave this one on the table, just like the last one. I think by what is being said, kind of where it's driving at. But I just want to ask the question, does this remind you of anything in our modern times? And I mean really modern, like every day we have to see this all the time on TV and other places. Let's just be aware that God had said way back to the Israelites, this is an example of what I want you to never do and not be a part of. And that was a part of this word fornication. And interesting. Definitely should heed this. In verse 8, we read this again, neither shalt thou eat. You know what? I put the same one twice. I'm gonna have to pull this up for you, and I'm gonna do that because this is important. So let me I have it up right here, verse 8, right here, Barnabas 10:8. See if I can get it big for you. There we go. Barnabas chapter 10, verse 8. Sorry to have to do that. I had my slide messed up. Barnabas 10:8, it says, moreover, he hath hated the weasel also, and with good reason. Thou shalt not, saith he, become such as those men of whom we hear, as working iniquity with their mouth for uncleanness. Neither shalt thou cleave to impure women who work iniquity with their mouth, for this animal conceiveth with its mouth. Now, this is one that I am again going to kind of leave to you to dive into and to understand. I'm not going to try to, this kind of thing might make you upset. It might rub you the wrong way. But the weasel here is a representation of men or women who perform sexual acts with their mouths. And, I know in Christianity generally, we get taught something that is different than this. All right, we get taught something that's a lot different than this. And we're going to actually touch on that a little later. So I'm not going to beat it to death here. And don't get upset by what you're reading or hearing. Just absorb it. Absorb that it's what they said in this first century Christian writing and how they thought. And you're going to just deal with that as time goes on. You got to figure out for yourself, is that what you believe? So then it's finished now in the Epistle of Barnabas chapter 10. It's now finished with the different animals and the sins that it's going to talk about. And so it starts kind of summarizing things a little bit. But in chapter 10, verse 9 and 10, it says these things. Concerning meats, then, Moses received 3 decrees to this effect and uttered them in a spiritual sense. But they, meaning the Israelites, accepted them according to the lust of the flesh, as though they referred only to eating. All right, so it's talking about how the Jews didn't quite get all the meaning that was there that God intended with these unclean animals and the law that was given concerning them. And in verse 10, it says David mentions the same in Psalms, and it quotes Psalm 1, verse 1, 2 different sections of it, and talks about it. So I encourage you to go there and read it, but just saying that, the Jews just didn't get it. When God was giving them these laws, there was meaning behind all of it. It was we're going to see later, just a few slides ahead, how it was a picture of the things to come for them, about the Redeemer, about the good things from the new covenant that came at the time of Christ. But they didn't get it. They didn't get the spiritual side of the law. And you can see that in the Pharisees, can't you? If you go to the Gospels and read about the Pharisees. So let's continue on there. So in also verse 11, he even answers the questions, why does chewing the cud matter? And why does the dividing of the hoof matter? Because that was the criteria that God gave in Leviticus for the animals they could eat that were clean if they chewed the cud and divided the hoof, meaning they had a divided hoof. And so this is how it answers that. It says, "Why cheweth the cud?" It says, "Those that fear the Lord chew or consume the word of the Lord daily." That's what it's talking about. That was the picture, the representation. Why that animal was clean, it was because it was a representation of the right thing to do. Chewing the cud was a symbol of consuming God's word and using it and meditating upon it. And it's what it says in that verse. And then why the dividing of the hoof? What did that mean? It answers the question. It means that the righteous man, if he is righteous, would walk both in this material world and in the holy world to come, as it calls it, of course, meaning the spiritual world. So it's like a symbol of the fact that we are in but not of this world. We still act in the material world, but our head, our citizenship, and our being is caught up in the spiritual world with Christ and God. And so that's to me an incredible symbol, but it's the dual reality that we have as Christians when we understand what's going on in the spiritual and we apply that to our physical lives. Amazing. So out of those, some of those symbols of those animals that were unclean, but had to do with particularly the uncleanness of things that we may have considered to be okay in marriage. I know that when I read that passage, this was one of the first things that came to my mind. So I wanted to at least address this. The first thing that pops in your head when you hear that statement about the weasel copulating with its mouth, and that was a picture of men who do impure things with their mouths and women who do impure things with their mouths sexually, that this verse came to mind that everyone always talks about, that is everything in the marriage bed undefiled, meaning you can essentially do anything in the marriage bed sexually and it's okay. But the question is everything permitted and good in the marriage bed? And that was the question I wanted to ask myself. So I found the verse that people use, and that's Hebrews 13, verse 4. And it says this specifically, and this is the quote: "Marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge." Now, note that this verse in the context of chapter 13 is in a list of admonitions or exhortations that the writer is giving to the Hebrews whom he's writing to. And so there's no other mention of the marriage bed. This is it. So in the context, is this verse, and my last point here, is it even discussing types of intercourse that may or may not be permitted in the marriage bed? And my answer to that is no, it's not. In the context, this verse is only saying that marriage is honorable in all things and the bed is undefiled. And there's a reason why they would say this to someone in the first century. So let's talk briefly about that. And again, this is the type of thing I want you to hear and absorb. Don't react to it right away, because it's the kind of thing, especially, like when I first heard it, I kind of reacted and I was like, that can't be right. That's different than I've always heard. But just hear this out, because as I've read many, many writings of the first couple centuries after Christ, I see this repeated again and again, the information that we're going to talk about right here. That sex in that time, like the physical union of a man and a woman, was seen as a very fleshly act. And that, by saying that, I mean like the desires of the flesh type of act. And this verse that we just saw, Hebrews 13:4, it says marriage is honorable and the bed undefiled. The reason it was written is because in the first century, it was seen as an honor to God and Christ to be a virgin and not to marry. So this was a thing, and as I have read Polycarp and other writings, the Acts of Thecla, all this other stuff, you can see that throughout the first century, Christians were, and this is even encouraged in the scriptures, but they saw being a virgin and never marrying as a very good thing. Like to be aspired to. If you could do it, you should do it. And so this verse was telling people it's okay to get married, that's good. It's not a bad thing. and that the marriage bed is undefiled, even though it's a fleshly act that sex is. It's not a defilement, that even though everyone wants to be a virgin at this point, to be faithful and true to God, that it is okay to be married. And that was the point of the verse in Hebrews 13, verse 4. Now, this statement about the virgin, now it's in other Christian writings, and I didn't go out and get all the references to those. I probably should have, but I think what I'll end up doing is doing another video on this one topic, because it can get big. But this virgin type thing, where it's like an honor to be a virgin in the first century, is mentioned in 1 Corinthians 7:37 and indirectly in Revelation 14:4. So you can look those verses up and see that it's talking about how good it is to be a virgin. And in Revelation, the saints, they were virgins. These were the virgins kept for God. And so because of those teachings, the people wanted to be virginal if they could and stay virgins and not marry. But realize that ravenous lust in the marriage bed, just like total desire and fulfilling desire, was seen as a fleshly thing, and it was to be avoided, even in the marriage bed. And that was the thought of that time. So I'm not telling you how you ought to think, but I'm telling you what it was like and what people thought and where these writings come from. And you have to make the decision, all right? So I'm trying to do this in the most kind of through the side doorway as possible. I don't want to hurt anyone or make anyone feel frustrated, angry. So let's continue. Now, another point that kind of came out of this to me was, I've been in contact with a lot of people that are in the Hebrew roots movement that see the Old Testament law as something we're supposed to, keep on a paper by our bed and read every night and make sure that we do all those things every day, according to diet, according to, 10 Commandments, and according to a lot of the other Levitical and Mosaic law. Some of these people will think that we're supposed to follow that to the letter even today. But to me, the text we read in the Epistle of Barnabas here points to the fact that the Old Covenant, including the statements concerning the clean and the unclean animals, was all pointing out sin to the Israelites. That was the purpose of all of it. And the book of Hebrews shows us that the Old Covenant was all types and shadows of the spiritual, which was the real, which came about in Christ. And it's spiritual. So just to me, it's like, he's saying that all the teachings of those laws they had a spiritual side that was important and the Israelites missed. And it's reinforced by what we've read here in the Epistle of Barnabas. So in Galatians 3:24 and 25, we see this, that the law was our schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ. And just as we've seen with these animals, it was exactly that. It was to teach us the spiritual side of why those were unclean animals, so we could go and not only, follow the laws of cleanness in animals, but then follow the laws of spiritual cleanness by being righteous and not committing the sins that they represented, to bring us unto Christ that we might be justified by faith. But after that faith is come, we are no longer under a schoolmaster. And of course, Galatians is talking about the faith that has come being Christ. And so we're no longer under that schoolmaster, and that is the law. We're no longer under it. In Hebrews 9:7 through 14, we see a few different things that reinforce the same thing. And it's that the temple on earth was a shadow of the same thing, but in heaven. So there's a counterpart to the temple that was on earth. It's not now, it was, but there was a counterpart always. Even when that was standing, there was a counterpart temple in heaven, of which Christ was the priest, right? And Hebrews goes all through this. And it says that this included the Holy of Holies, and that's in chapter 9, verses 8 and 12. And it's mentioned that whole passage you need to read through. But it says also in verse 13 that the blood sacrifices of all the animals and the ashes and everything was for the purifying of flesh, but that the sacrifice that Christ gave was for the purifying of spirit. Because the law could never purify the spirit. That was only by faith, and it was only through Christ. And because the law pointed them to Christ, in their faith in that, they were saved. It wasn't through the doing of the law. Do you see how that worked? But then Christ came, he even annulled the law, and that's all through Hebrews. We must understand the difference between the physical and the spiritual. There's two sides of this life. There's the physical life that we're leading, and it's going to be short like a vapor, and it's going to be gone. And then there's the spiritual life that's now and forever. Both are real. Only one is not visible to us now. And it will be in the future when we die and we pass. Our spirit is not in this body. We will then be able to see the spiritual. Faith, and this is part of Hebrews, people always use this verse. They don't really, I think, sometimes know what it means, but faith is the evidence of things not seen. Well, what is the things not seen? It's Christ. It's God in heaven on his throne. It's this temple in heaven. It's the new Jerusalem that's going to come down out of heaven. Oh my goodness. I mean, it's all these things, and the spiritual world is as real as the physical. It's just we're not a part of it yet. We're not acting in it, but we know of it. And so our faith is the evidence of those things that are not seen. And that's in Hebrews 11:1. It's the faith chapter. The law that we've read and we're talking about with the animals and the cleanness, it was a physical representation of the spiritual, the real, as Hebrews says. It uses that word. It's the real. The old covenant in Hebrews 9:23 was a pattern of things in the heavens. It was a picture of the things in the heavens. And the law was a shadow of the good things to come. And that's, of course, from the perspective of the Israelites. For us, it's in our past. For them, it was in their future. It was the good things to come in Christ. Hebrews 10:1. So the book of Hebrews makes these points about 100 different ways, and it is that Christ ended the old covenant. Christ was the start of the new covenant, and he fulfilled the law and the prophets. He said so himself in Matthew. And I'm just saying, you can't read through the book of Hebrews with a sound mind and think that the old covenant is still in force. It's not. It's not. And in summary for this whole thing now, we've gone through those couple points I kind of pulled out because it felt like they were pertinent to what we talked about with the unclean animals. But this is the summary of the whole thing, kind of. Animals that were unclean were declared so by God to be a continuous picture of sin for Israel and for us, really. This was the whole point of the Old Covenant, including the Mosaic Law. It was a shadow of the real, spiritual, the temple, the Christ, and the heavenly things, which were in the future for the Israelites, as we said, but are in our past. Christ came and fulfilled that old covenant, which was in our past. So I won't even add anything to that. It's pretty good. Makes sense. Does this mean that the warnings of the unclean animals that we've read now in the Epistle of Barnabas and in Leviticus 11 are not valid for us now in the new covenant? No, because it was pointing us to sin. We still need to be aware of sin and avoid it. This has not changed. The animal character sketches in Barnabas are valuable for us every day of our lives because we don't want to sin. We don't want to because we want to obey. We want to obey Christ. But we do not obey to fulfill the law anymore. We don't obey to fill that Levitical law. We obey in gratitude to Jesus because he was the target of the law. All of the law, all the stuff, it was all pointing and culminating in Christ. And so we now look back at Christ in gratitude and obey, whereas the Israelites looked forward in faith and obeyed. And so, man, it's such a beautiful picture of what the relationship to our Savior and how, the goal of the law, the meaning of the law is still valid for us. It's about sin and doing righteousness. We still need to do righteousness. But it's not about whether you eat a pig today or not. It's about understanding what was behind that picture, that symbol. So I hope that this has been helpful for you guys. This was a lot of fun. It's been a long time coming. I'll probably get in trouble, by the powers that be for some of the things that were in the Epistle of Barnabas, excuse me. But after a long deliberation, I figured it was worth it. I think this information is so pertinent to us today, even, and it helps us understand how the law was used by God back then through Moses to the Israelites as a picture of sin. So they understood, because they didn't have Christ, they didn't have the one who was going to redeem and give us a pure picture of righteousness on earth. They didn't have that picture, so they needed a different picture. And God gave that to them in the law. And it's just so exciting to me to find these old writings that encapsulated the understanding that we miss sometimes. We just miss it in our modern day and age. We don't read these writings. We don't read anything, really. Most Christians barely read the Bible. So I encourage you to grab a hold of these and read through them. Read through them. And then compare them to your scriptures. And then pray to God as to what He would have you understand out of that. So I appreciate you guys. Thanks for joining me again. Like and subscribe, and God bless.